With his ranch on the brink of bankruptcy and a severe drought killing his cattle, Thomas Blackwood makes one final desperate attempt to save 4 generations of ranching legacy, digging deeper into the parched earth that had sustained his ancestors. Since the 1880s, what he doesn't realize is that 8 feet below his determined shovel strikes lies not water, but a perfectly preserved stagecoach filled with Klondike Gold Rush, treasure worth millions and evidence of a century-old robbery that would shake the foundations of Silver Creek County's most powerful family. As historian Dr. Rebecca Winters helps authenticate his accidental discovery, Thomas finds himself caught between instant wealth and revealing a criminal conspiracy that shaped the region's history, but might cost him the very ranch he's fighting to save. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The 3-month drought had turned Whispering Pines Ranch into a landscape that resembled the surface of Mars more than the fertile valley it had once been. The stock ponds that Thomas Blackwood's great-grandfather had dug by hand stood empty, their cracked beds a testament to the severity of the water shortage plaguing Silver Creek County. Thomas stood at the edge of what should have been a lush pasture, boots sinking into soil that had once been rich and giving, but now crumbled like ash beneath his weight. At 38, he had weathered challenging seasons before, but nothing like this. His weathered face had settled into permanent lines of worry. His powerful shoulders, built through decades of physical labor, now stooped with the weight of impending failure. "It's not looking good, Duke," he said to the aging cattle dog at his heels. The dog whined softly, pressing against his leg as they walked toward the eastern pasture, where the last working well had run dry 3 days earlier. The Blackwood family had survived the Great Depression, weathered the farming crisis of the 1980s, and adapted to changing markets for generations. But this drought, combined with 3 consecutive years of falling beef prices, had pushed Whispering Pines Ranch to the brink of collapse. Thomas knelt beside the dry well, testing the hand pump that wheezed and groaned but produced nothing. The county inspector's report had been delivered yesterday, condemning the well as depleted beyond recovery and recommending Thomas connect to the municipal water system. $45,000 expense he couldn't begin to afford, with the bank already threatening foreclosure. 200 head of cattle had been sold off at a fraction of their value, reducing his projected income to barely 15% of normal. His last working tractor needed repairs he'd been putting off for months, and the property taxes were already 45 days overdue. Thomas squinted toward the modest 2-story ranch house where 3 generations of Blackwoods had been born and raised. The white paint was peeling, the porch sagging in one corner. His mother had planted roses along the front walk before cancer took her 3 years ago. They had died within weeks of the drought's onset, as if in sympathy with the failing ranch. The sound of tires on gravel announced a visitor. Thomas turned to see a cloud of dust trailing behind a silver pickup truck bearing the logo of Frontier Agricultural Bank. Sarah Donovan had been the regional loan officer for Frontier for nearly 12 years. She knew every rancher in the county by name and could recite their cattle bloodlines from memory. Her grandfather had been a cattle rancher who eventually lost his land during the farm crisis, giving her a deeper understanding of agricultural struggles than most bankers. Today, her normally friendly expression was replaced with professional detachment as she approached Thomas. "I wish this was just a social call," she greeted him with a nod. "Final notice?" he asked, though he already knew the answer. She handed him an envelope. 60 days, Thomas. That's all the extension I could get you. Corporate's breathing down my neck about non-performing loans in the region. He took the envelope without opening it. "Thanks for trying, Sarah. I know you went to bat for me." She glanced at the dry well, then back to him. "Have you considered Stanford's offer?" Thomas's jaw tightened. Harrison Stanford III, the heir to Silver Creek Mining and the county's largest landowner, had been making increasingly aggressive offers to buy Whispering Pines Ranch for the past year. His latest offer was 3 times the property's market value, a premium that made Thomas suspicious of the man's motives. "I'm not selling to Stanford," he said flatly. "Not while I still have options." Sarah's expression softened slightly. "Thomas, I understand the ranch has been in your family for generations, but at some point, you have to face reality." "Without water, I'll find water," he interrupted. "There's an underground spring on this property my great-grandfather documented it in his journals. The well just isn't deep enough anymore." She sighed, clearly having heard similar desperate theories from other ranchers facing foreclosure. "Just don't wait too long to consider alternatives. Stanford's offer won't stay on the table indefinitely." After Sarah left, Thomas stood motionless. Beside the well, the bank notice crumpled in his fist. Duke pressed against his leg, offering silent comfort. That evening, after reviewing the ranch's finances and finding no path to solvency through conventional means, Thomas climbed to the attic of the ranch house. Dust motes danced in the beam of his flashlight as he made his way to an old cedar chest tucked beneath the eaves. The chest had belonged to his great-grandfather, Jeremiah Blackwood, who had claimed this land in 1883 after working as a guide for mining expeditions in Alaska. Family legend held that Jeremiah had used his wilderness survival skills to establish a ranch when neighboring homesteaders had failed to find sustainable water sources. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Thomas lifted the heavy lid, revealing neatly stacked leather-bound journals, surveying tools, and geological specimens carefully labeled in faded handwriting. He hadn't examined these materials since inheriting the ranch from his father 10 years ago, viewing them more as family heirlooms than practical resources. The earliest journal, dated 1883, detailed Jeremiah's methodical search for water. May 17, 1883. "I have observed the morning mist patterns for 2 months and am convinced a significant underground water source runs beneath the eastern meadow." The Sioux Scouts spoke of a river that runs beneath the earth here, carrying not just water but spirits of abundance. White settlers dismiss such tales, but I have found indigenous knowledge of land and water to be superior to our own in many respects. Thomas flipped forward, looking for specific details about the well's construction. June 12, 1883. "Began digging the eastern well today. The soil changes character at approximately 6 feet depth, becoming more gravelly and moist. I am optimistic about striking water within another day's digging." June 13, 1883. "Encountered an unexpected obstacle at 8 feet depth. My shovel struck something solid, not bedrock, but wood. Further investigation reveals what appears to be the top of a buried stagecoach. This is most unusual and bears careful examination." The description caught Thomas's attention. A buried stagecoach? He continued reading, fascinated. June 14, 1883. "I have partially excavated the stagecoach. It appears to have been deliberately buried, not lost in some natural disaster. The coach bears the markings of the Northern Frontier Transport Company, which operated routes to the Klondike Gold Fields. Most astonishing of all, the coach contains several strong boxes. Upon opening one, I discovered gold coins and nuggets, clearly the proceeds of successful mining operations. This raises troubling questions about how such a valuable cargo came to be buried on what is now my property." June 20, 1883. "Judge Stanford visited today, expressing unusual interest in purchasing the eastern section of my claim. Offered twice the going rate. When I declined, suggesting the entire homestead was not for sale, his manner turned cold. Mentioned that water rights in the territory remain legally ambiguous, and that I would be wise to accept his generosity." Thomas sat back against a roof beam, his mind racing. His great-grandfather had discovered a buried stagecoach filled with Klondike gold, and a Stanford had shown interest in the property even then. Could the stagecoach still be there, its treasure intact? And if so, did that explain Harrison Stanford's unusually generous offers, a continuation of his ancestors' interest? The possibility gave Thomas a renewed sense of purpose. If he could find evidence of the stagecoach and its contents on his property, he might be able to secure the funds needed to save the ranch, or at least negotiate with Stanford from a position of knowledge rather than desperation. Next morning, Thomas began preparations to excavate the eastern well. Without funds to hire a professional excavation team, he would have to rely on muscle power and determination, just as his great-grandfather had done. He gathered old tools from the barn, pickaxes, shovels, and a hand-operated winch system his grandfather had used for well maintenance decades ago. As the sun climbed higher, Thomas secured ropes around the well's edge and lowered himself into its cool depths. The stone walls were a testament to his great-grandfather's craftsmanship, each rock perfectly fitted against its neighbors without mortar, creating a structure that had lasted more than a century. At the bottom, no water remained where once a constant flow had bubbled up from below. Thomas set his lantern on a small ledge and began to dig, each strike of his shovel against the compacted earth echoing up the stone cylinder. He didn't notice the black SUV that had parked on the county road, its occupant observing his activities through high-powered binoculars, or the urgent phone call being made to Silver Creek Mining's executive offices. For 2 days Thomas worked, from dawn until dusk, stopping only when light failed completely. The well's depth increased foot by painstaking foot, the excavated soil hauled up in buckets and spread across his parched fields. Each evening he would collapse into his grandfather's old armchair, muscles aching, hands blistered despite his work gloves, and read more from Jeremiah's journals for guidance. On the third day, as Thomas's shovel struck the compacted earth at what he estimated to be 10 feet below the surface, something changed. The soil's consistency shifted from dry clay to a more gravelly material. A few more strikes, and his shovel hit something solid with a distinctive wooden thunk. Finally, Thomas muttered, wiping sweat from his brow. He cleared away more soil, revealing weathered wooden planking, unmistakably man-made, not a natural formation. Heart-pounding, he carefully excavated around the object, gradually exposing what appeared to be the curved roof of a stagecoach, partially collapsed but remarkably preserved in the dry earth. Thomas stared at the discovery, connecting pieces of a puzzle he hadn't known existed until this moment. Jeremiah's journal entries about the buried stagecoach, Harrison Stanford's persistent interest in buying the property, the unusually generous offers. This wasn't about water rights or prime agricultural land. It was about what lay beneath. Working with renewed energy, Thomas expanded the excavation, revealing more of the stagecoach. The faded but still visible insignia matched Jeremiah's description, Northern Frontier Transport Company. As he cleared soil from around the driver's seat area, something gleamed in the lantern light, metal that had once been hidden beneath a century of dirt. A strongbox, its lock corroded but intact. Using his pocket knife, Thomas carefully pried open the degraded lock. Inside, nestled in rotting velvet, lay rows of gold coins and several small leather pouches. With trembling hands he opened one pouch, pouring its contents into his palm gold nuggets, their dull gleam unmistakable even after more than a century underground. "Duke," he called up to the dog who had remained a faithful sentinel at the well's edge, "we've got something better than water, boy." Using his phone, he recorded video of the stagecoach and strongbox, narrating the date, time, and approximate depth of the discovery. This was evidence he needed to document before approaching anyone. That evening, Thomas pored over Jeremiah's journals with new understanding, finding entries he'd previously skimmed. July 5, 1883, my inquiries in town have yielded troubling information. The Northern Frontier coach discovered on my property appears to match descriptions of one that disappeared 3 years ago while transporting gold from the Klondike fields. The coach was reported attacked by bandits, all passengers and guards killed. However, no bodies were ever found, and the gold was assumed stolen. How then did the coach come to be buried on my land, its cargo intact? July 12, 1883. A disturbing visit from Sheriff Wilson today. Claims there have been complaints about trespassers on my property affecting adjacent lands, all owned by Stanford interests. Demanded I cease digging and exploration pending investigation. When I requested documentation of these complaints, he became hostile. I have no choice but to comply temporarily, though I suspect underhanded tactics. August 3, 1883. Received official notice that new territorial regulations prohibit private excavations within 500 yards of property boundaries. A category suddenly expanded to include the eastern section of my land. The notice cites potential structural damage concerns and is signed by Judge Stanford in his capacity as county commissioner. The timing and specificity of this regulation cannot be coincidence. August 30, 1883. Made a troubling discovery. Today while in town for supplies. Overheard conversation between Stanford and unknown associates discussing a transport operation and securing evidence. When they noticed my presence, conversation ceased abruptly. I am now convinced the Stagecoach has greater significance than I realized. Thomas leaned back in his chair, pieces falling into place. His great-grandfather had discovered evidence of what appeared to be a stage robbery and murder, and the Stanfords had attempted to force him off his land to hide it. When that failed, they'd used their political influence to restrict his excavation, a pattern that seemed to be repeating itself over a century later. But why hadn't the Stanfords simply claimed the gold through legal means? Thomas recalled something from a property law course he'd taken at the agricultural college. In this state, prior to 1900, found treasure was typically awarded to the property owner unless someone could prove prior ownership. If Jeremiah had maintained ownership through those early challenges, the Stagecoach and its contents would still belong to the Blackwood family. Sleep eluded Thomas that night as he considered his options. By law, he should report the historical find, notify the State Historical Society, and proceed through proper channels. But doing so would immediately alert the Stanfords, who now controlled most of the regulatory bodies in the county. Given their family's apparent history with his land, he didn't trust the process to be fair. The next morning, Thomas made a decision. Before going public with his discovery, he needed expert confirmation and documentation that couldn't be easily dismissed or buried in bureaucracy. He needed someone knowledgeable about historical artifacts but not connected to local interests. His search led him to Dr. Rebecca Winters, an associate professor of historical archaeology at the State University and an independent consultant whose published papers frequently criticize the destruction of historical sites by mining operations, including those owned by Silver Creek Mining. Her reputation for uncompromising academic integrity made her the perfect ally for his situation. Thomas composed a careful email, including some of his video documentation, but withholding specific location details. He requested a confidential consultation, offering to pay her standard fee despite his financial situation. To his surprise, Dr. Winters responded within hours, "Mr. Blackwood, your discovery appears significant from the limited data provided. The coach design and insignia match those used during the Klondike Gold Rush period, and the strong box is consistent with those used to transport mining proceeds. I'm intrigued professionally and happen to be in your state for a conference this week. I can make time for a site visit tomorrow if that suits. And please don't worry about the fee. This is historically interesting enough to warrant my time." Rebecca Winters, Ph.D. When Dr. Winters arrived the following day, Thomas was struck by how different she was from his mental image of a historical archaeologist. He'd expected someone older, perhaps more academic in appearance. Instead, Rebecca Winters was in her mid-30s, dressed practically in hiking boots, cargo pants, and a worn university sweatshirt. Her auburn hair was pulled back in a practical ponytail, and she wore minimal makeup that did nothing to hide her spray of freckles across her nose and cheeks. "Mr. Blackwood," she greeted him, extending a hand that was strong and calloused from field work. "Thank you for reaching out. Your discovery could be quite significant if it's what I suspect." "Just Thomas, please," he replied, shaking her hand. "And I appreciate your discretion. The situation is complicated. In my experience, when historical artifacts are involved, it always is," she said with a knowing smile. "Show me what you found." Thomas led her to the well, explaining his great-grandfather's original discovery and the recent drought that had prompted his deeper excavation. As they walked, he noticed a tenseness in her posture when he mentioned Silver Creek mining. "And the Stanford family. You're familiar with them?" he asked. Rebecca's expression hardened slightly. "I've had professional disagreements with Silver Creek. 2 years ago, I published research demonstrating that their open-pit operations were destroying significant historical sites related to indigenous peoples and early settlers. They attempted to discredit my findings rather than address the problems." She shrugged. "Standard corporate tactics when profits are threatened by academic research." At the well, Thomas lowered a specialized camera Rebecca had brought, allowing them to examine the stagecoach without descending. The feed displayed on her tablet, showing the coach and strongbox he'd discovered. "This is remarkable," she murmured, eyes fixed on the screen. "Based on the design features and insignia, this is definitely a Northern Frontier transport coach from the 1880s Klondike period." She glanced up at him. "Thomas, do you understand what this might represent historically?" He nodded slowly. "That's why I needed expert confirmation before going public. The Stanfords have been trying to buy this land for years. Now I know why." Rebecca manipulated the camera controls, examining the coach's structure and the surrounding soil formation. "This isn't just a random burial. The coach was deliberately concealed, and from what I can see, there's no evidence of the reported bandit attack. No bullet holes, no signs of violence." She tapped some notes into her tablet. "This could potentially rewrite a piece of regional history and implicate one of the area's most powerful families in a historical crime." The implication was so large it seemed abstract to Thomas, impossible to reconcile with his immediate reality of overdue bills and foreclosure notices. "What's the next step?" he asked, his voice steadier than he felt. "Legally, you should file a historical discovery notice with the State Historical Society," Rebecca said. "That would protect your claim while proper assessment is conducted." She hesitated. "But given what you've told me about the Stanfords and their local influence, that might alert them before you're prepared to deal with the pressure they'll apply." Thomas appreciated her understanding of the delicate situation. "What would you recommend?" "We need more data and documentation that can't be easily dismissed." Rebecca tucked her tablet into her backpack. "I have equipment in my car that can help us document the find properly and gauge its historical significance without alerting anyone. With solid academic evidence, you'll be in a stronger position to protect your interests." As they walked back toward the ranch house, Thomas noticed a familiar silver pickup truck approaching on the county road. Sarah Donovan from the bank, making an unexpected visit. "We have company," he said quietly to Rebecca. "The bank loan officer. Not necessarily a Stanford ally, but definitely someone who would report unusual activity." Rebecca nodded. "I'll follow your lead." Sarah parked beside Rebecca's university-logoed SUV, her expression curious as she approached Thomas. "I was in the area and thought I'd check in." Her gaze shifted to Rebecca. "I didn't realize you had company." "Dr. Rebecca Winters," Thomas introduced, deciding that partial truth was safest. "She's a historical agriculture specialist from the university, helping me assess options for traditional water conservation techniques. Rebecca smoothly extended her hand. Mr. Blackwood's case is particularly interesting from a historical perspective. We're seeing similar issues across the state, with ranches that have historical water management systems failing during extended drought conditions. Sarah seemed to accept this explanation, though her eyes lingered on Rebecca's vehicle. That's progressive thinking, Thomas. But I should remind you that the foreclosure timeline remains unchanged unless substantial payment is made. I understand, Thomas replied. I'm exploring all options. After Sarah left, Rebecca raised an eyebrow. Historical agriculture specialist? Thomas shrugged. Not entirely a lie. We are dealing with a historical discovery on agricultural land, she laughed, the sound warming the space between them. Fair enough, but that visit wasn't coincidental. Someone's watching your property, Thomas. We need to work quickly. Unknown to either of them, Sarah Donovan was already on the phone as she drove away. But not to Frontier Agricultural Bank. Her call was to a private number used by Harrison Stanford III. He has someone from the university with him, she reported. Claims she's a historical agriculture specialist, but the vehicle has archaeology department markings. You said to report anything unusual. On the other end of the line, Harrison Stanford's voice remained calm despite the implications. You've done well, Sarah. Continue as we discussed. The foreclosure must proceed regardless of any developments. And my brother's debt? She asked, tension evident in her voice. Will be forgiven upon successful acquisition of the Blackwood property, Stanford confirmed. Your family's financial troubles will disappear, provided you continue to be useful. As he ended the call, Stanford turned to the elderly man seated across from him in the wood-paneled office of Silver Creek Mining headquarters, his father, Harrison Stanford, Jr., whose failing health had accelerated their plans. Blackwood may have discovered what's beneath his land, the younger Stanford reported. He's brought in outside expertise. The older man's face remained impassive, liver-spotted hands resting on an ornate walking cane. History repeats itself, he said quietly. My grandfather faced the same problem with Jeremiah Blackwood. The old man was stubborn, refused to sell despite the pressure we applied. Times have changed, his son assured him. We control the regulatory bodies now, the banking system. Blackwood is already drowning in debt. One way or another, that land will finally become Stanford property. The elder Stanford nodded slowly. See that it does. That stagecoach has been rightfully ours for 3 generations. I won't go to my grave with it still in Blackwood hands. Back at Whispering Pines Ranch, as the sun began to set, Rebecca and Thomas examined the video footage and photographs they had taken of the stagecoach and its contents, confirming the historical significance of the find. This is extraordinary, Thomas, Rebecca said, looking up from her analysis equipment. Based on these readings and images, what you've discovered is almost certainly the missing Northern Frontier transport coach that disappeared in 1880 while carrying gold from the Klondike fields. According to historical records, the gold shipment was valued at over $300,000 in $1,880. Thomas stared at her, unable to fully process the figures. What would that be worth today? Conservatively, millions, Rebecca replied. And that's just the raw gold value. The historical significance and numismatic value of the coins could multiply that significantly. Add in the perfectly preserved stagecoach itself, and we're talking about one of the most significant historical discoveries in the region's history. Just days ago, he'd been facing the loss of everything his family had built over generations. Now he was discussing wealth beyond anything he'd ever imagined. What do I do with this information? He asked quietly. The Stanfords clearly know. Something is here. They've been trying to get this land for over a century. Rebecca considered the question carefully. You have several options, each with different implications. You could report the find to the Historical Society, and deal with the likely legal challenges from the Stanfords, sell the rights to a museum or historical preservation group, or attempt to leverage the discovery to secure financing that would save your ranch. She paused, studying his face. But first, I think we need to understand exactly what happened between your great-grandfather and the Stanfords. There may be legal complications from previous agreements or claims that could affect your options today. Thomas nodded, thinking of the family journals in the attic. Jeremiah documented everything meticulously. If there were any legal maneuvers or threats, he would have recorded them. Then that's our next step, Rebecca decided. Before we make any moves that can't be undone, we need the full historical picture. She glanced at her watch. It's getting late. I should head back to my hotel in town. You could stay here, Thomas offered, then immediately felt self-conscious. I mean, there's plenty of room. The ranch house has 4 bedrooms. It would give us more time to go through Jeremiah's journals. Rebecca hesitated, then nodded. That makes practical sense. Let me get my overnight bag from the car. As darkness settled over Whispering Pines Ranch, neither Thomas nor Rebecca noticed the drone hovering at the edge of visual range, its high-resolution camera capturing their movements, or the 2 men in a Silver Creek mining security vehicle parked a half-mile down the county road, monitoring their activities. The attic of the Blackwood ranch house had become an impromptu research center, with Jeremiah's journals arranged chronologically on a weathered oak table Thomas had carried up from the dining room. Dusty banker's boxes containing family correspondence and legal documents from the past century formed precarious towers around them. Rebecca sat cross-legged on an old quilt, hair pulled back in a messy bun, glasses perched on her nose as she carefully turned to the brittle pages of Jeremiah's 1883 journal. Thomas sorted through a box of correspondence, scanning for any mention of the Stanford family or references to the Stagecoach. Listen to this, Rebecca said, excitement evident in her voice. March 8, 1883. Judge Stanford's regulatory assault continues. New county ordinance prohibits excavation within 100 yards of any water source, citing public safety concerns. The ordinance affects only my property, as no other significant excavations are publicly known in the county. The intent is transparent: to render my eastern acreage unusable, forcing me to sell. Thomas nodded grimly. It matches what I found in these letters. The Stanfords have used regulations as a weapon for generations. He held up a yellowed paper. Here's one from the county assessor in 1884. Suddenly revaluing Whispering Pines Ranch at triple its previous tax assessment, citing potential historical resources despite no official claim being filed. They worked through the night piecing together a historical narrative that spanned more than a century. The pattern was consistent. Each generation of Stanford had attempted to acquire the Blackwood property through increasingly sophisticated means, from outright intimidation in Jeremiah's time to complex financial and regulatory pressure in recent decades. As dawn light filtered through the dusty attic windows, Rebecca carefully unfolded a yellowed document she'd found tucked into the binding of the 1884 journal. Thomas, she said softly, I think this is what we've been looking for. He moved to her side, their shoulders touching as they examined the document together. A newspaper clipping dated October 1880, reporting the mysterious disappearance of a northern frontier transport stagecoach carrying Klondike gold. The article listed the driver and guards by name, including one James Stanford, described as a security contractor. James Stanford, Thomas said, the implications sinking in. An ancestor of the current Stanfords, working as security for the very stagecoach that ended up buried on my land. And look at this notation in the margin, Rebecca pointed to handwriting they now recognized as Jeremiah's. Sheriff Wilson revealed while drunk, J. Stanford sole survivor of attack. Reported all others killed and gold stolen by bandits who fled. No bodies ever recovered. They stared at each other as the full implication became clear. James Stanford wasn't just security, Thomas said slowly. He was part of the robbery. He killed the others, took the gold, and somehow ended up burying the coach on what would later become my great-grandfather's land. Rebecca turned back to the 1884 journal, scanning the entries until she found what she was looking for. Here. April 3rd, 1884. After discreet inquiries, I've confirmed my suspicions. Before claiming this land, I worked briefly at the Silver Creek mining office. Records there showed that James Stanford purchased large tracts of land and founded the company shortly after the Stagecoach robbery. His sudden wealth was attributed to a fortunate investment, but the timing aligns perfectly with the disappearance of the Klondike shipment. That explains why Judge Stanford was so desperate to acquire this specific section of land from Jeremiah. Thomas added, his brother or father had buried the evidence of his crime here, probably intending to retrieve the gold later. But Jeremiah claimed the land before he could. Rebecca carefully set the journal aside. The Stanfords built their entire fortune on that stolen gold. Silver Creek mining, their political influence, everything stems from that original crime. If this became public knowledge, it would destroy their carefully constructed historical narrative, Thomas finished. No wonder they've been trying to get this land for generations. It's not just about the remaining gold in that stagecoach. It's about keeping their family's criminal origins buried. They continued their research throughout the morning, discovering increasingly aggressive tactics by the Stanfords as they realized the extent of what Jeremiah had found and the legal obstacles to obtaining it. May 10, 1884. Attempt to burn barn last night. Sheriff refuses to investigate, claiming no evidence of foul play despite clear boot prints leading from Stanford property. Have begun sleeping with rifle nearby. September 5, 1884. Suspicious cattle illness. Discovered poisoned salt lick placed at property boundary. Territorial inspector in Stanford's pocket claims no evidence. Have lost 8 head this month. December 10, 1884. Stanford men sabotaged well, destroying upper wall structure. Repairs. Will take weeks. Must haul water from creek meanwhile. Will not be driven off by these tactics. The journals detailed years of resistance, with Jeremiah ultimately prevailing through a combination of legal maneuvering, community alliance building, and sheer determination. By 1890, the Stanfords had apparently shifted strategies, moving from direct pressure to more subtle long-term approaches, buying surrounding properties, controlling local water rights, and gradually establishing dominance over county politics and financial institutions. Jeremiah outmaneuvered them, Thomas said with pride as they reviewed the historical record. But they never gave up. They just changed tactics and waited for a vulnerable moment, like now with the drought and my financial situation. History repeating itself. With one critical difference, Rebecca murmured. What's that? Jeremiah didn't have solid proof of the Stanford family's criminal origins. She held up the newspaper clipping and journal entries they'd found. You do, and we have something else Jeremiah didn't have. What? Digital evidence that can't be destroyed or suppressed. She held up a small device. I've been backing up everything we've found, the journals, the newspaper clipping, the photographs, and my scientific analysis, to secure cloud storage that the Stanfords can't access or tamper with. Thomas felt a wave of gratitude toward this woman who had arrived as a consultant, but had thrown herself fully into uncovering the truth, matching his own determination with her academic expertise. A noise from outside interrupted their conversation, the distinctive sound of vehicles on the gravel driveway. Thomas moved to the attic window, tension evident in his shoulders as he peered down at the visitors. 3 vehicles, he reported. Grimly, bank truck, county sheriff's car, and a Silver Creek mining SUV. Rebecca quickly gathered the most crucial documents. They're moving faster than I expected. We need to secure this evidence before they come in. You think they would confiscate private property? Thomas asked, though he already knew the answer based on Jeremiah's experiences. I think a family that's waited over a century for that gold wouldn't hesitate to ensure inconvenient historical documents disappeared, Rebecca replied, carefully placing the original newspaper clipping and key journal pages into her laptop case. Making digital backups is prudent, but keeping the original safe is crucial. The sound of a firm knock echoed through the house, followed by Duke's warning barks. Thomas took a deep breath, squaring his shoulders in a gesture that reminded Rebecca of the portrait of Jeremiah Blackwood they'd found among the family photographs. Stay here, he told her. If things go badly, get out through the back stairs with the evidence. Downstairs, Thomas opened the front door to find Sheriff Paul Martinez, flanked by Sarah from the bank and a man in expensive suit he recognized as Harrison Stanford III. The contrast between the weathered rancher and the impeccably dressed mining executive couldn't have been more stark. Mr. Blackwood, the sheriff began, his discomfort evident. We've received reports of unauthorized excavation on your property that may violate county regulations. I have a warrant to inspect the premises. Thomas kept his expression neutral, though his heart pounded. What regulations would those be, Sheriff? Stanford stepped forward, his smile not reaching his eyes. Historical preservation ordinances, Mr. Blackwood. Our county takes its heritage very seriously. Any artifacts discovered must be properly reported to the Historical Society, which, as you know, I chair. Interesting timing, Thomas remarked. I wasn't aware the county had suddenly developed such concern for historical preservation, especially given Silver Creek Mining's record of destroying indigenous archaeological sites. Stanford's smile tightened. The law applies to everyone, Mr. Blackwood. May we come in? Do I have a choice? Thomas stepped aside, allowing them to enter. Sarah Donovan avoided making eye contact as she followed the men inside. I'm here as an observer for the bank, she explained quietly. Given that this property is collateral for your loans, any potential regulatory violations could affect the terms of your agreement. Thomas led them to the living room, deliberately keeping them away from the attic stairs. What exactly are you looking for, Sheriff? Martinez glanced uncomfortably at Stanford before answering. We've received information that you may have discovered items of historical significance during unauthorized well excavation. County regulations require immediate reporting of such finds. Regulations that were enacted just last week, I imagine? Thomas kept his tone conversational, but his implication was clear. Stanford's patience visibly thinned. Mr. Blackwood, let's dispense with the games. We know you've been digging at the eastern well. We know you've discovered something significant. And we know you've brought in outside expertise. He gestured toward the window, where Rebecca's university vehicle was visible in the driveway. I'm exploring water alternatives for my ranch, Thomas replied evenly. And consulting with experts is hardly a crime. No, but failing to report historical discoveries is, Stanford countered. As is interfering with a historical investigation. He turned to the sheriff. I think we should examine the well site. As they moved toward the door, Rebecca appeared. At the bottom of the stairs, composed and professional in her demeanor. Actually, any historical investigation would fall under state jurisdiction, not county, she stated, approaching with confident steps. Dr. Rebecca Winters, Historical Archaeology, State University. She handed the sheriff her credentials. I'm here conducting a preliminary assessment for Mr. Blackwood, after which we intended to file the appropriate reports with the State Historical Society. The sheriff examined her identification while Stanford's expression darkened. Dr. Winters, he said, recognition in his voice. Your reputation precedes you, particularly your antagonistic stance toward mining operations. My stance is toward preservation of historical artifacts and compliance with state regulations, she corrected. And speaking of regulations, Sheriff Martinez, I should inform you that I've already filed a preliminary notice with the State Archaeological Board this morning, which places any findings under their jurisdiction, pending full evaluation. Thomas struggled to keep the surprise from his face. This was news to him, but he trusted Rebecca's strategy. I have no record of such a filing, Stanford interjected. You wouldn't, Rebecca replied smoothly. The State Board doesn't report to county officials, particularly when those officials might have conflicts of interest with the matter at hand. She turned to the sheriff. I'm sure you're aware that interfering with the state-level historical assessment carries significant penalties. Martinez shifted uncomfortably, clearly caught between Stanford's expectations and the potential legal complications Rebecca had introduced. Perhaps we should verify the status of this filing before proceeding. Stanford's jaw tightened, but he maintained his composure. By all means. In the meantime, I think it's worth reminding Mr. Blackwood that his financial situation remains precarious. He nodded toward Sarah. Perhaps Ms. Donovan could clarify the implications of any delays in addressing his outstanding loans. Sarah stepped forward, her professional demeanor at odds with the tension in the room. The foreclosure timeline remains in effect, Mr. Blackwood. Without substantial payment within the 60-day window, the bank will have no choice but to proceed with repossession. And my offer to purchase the property still stands, Stanford added. In fact, given these complications, I'm willing to increase it by another 15%. A clean, simple transaction that would resolve all these unpleasantries. Thomas met Stanford's gaze directly. I appreciate the offer, Mr. Stanford, but I'm not interested in selling my family's legacy. Especially not now that I understand why your family has been so persistent in trying to acquire it for over a century. Something flickered in Stanford's eyes, a moment of uncertainty that suggested Thomas's implied knowledge had struck home, but he recovered quickly. I'm simply a businessman recognizing potential value where others see only struggle, Stanford replied smoothly. But I respect your determination, misguided though it may be. Sheriff, let's verify Dr. Winter's filing status before we proceed further. As they departed, the threat in Stanford's parting glance was unmistakable. This skirmish might have ended in a stalemate, but the battle was far from over. When they were alone, Thomas turned to Rebecca with newfound respect. You filed with the State Board this morning? She smiled, the tension leaving her shoulders. Actually, no, but I did as soon as I saw their vehicles arriving. Emergency electronic filing from my phone while you were coming downstairs. It won't hold them off forever, but it buys us time. Thomas laughed despite the gravity of the situation. Quick thinking. Academic politics can be brutal, she replied. You learn to navigate bureaucracy creatively. But Thomas, they're going to challenge this at every level. The Stanfords clearly have resources and influence throughout the local system. Then we need to go above the local system, Thomas decided. And we need to move quickly. Stanford wasn't bluffing about the foreclosure. That's very real. They spent the afternoon strategizing, evaluating options that would both protect the historical discovery and provide Thomas with the financial means to save his ranch. The complexity of the situation was daunting, involving historical preservation laws, potential criminal implications for the Stanford family, property rights, and the immediate practical concern of the impending foreclosure. What we need, Rebecca said as they reviewed their notes at the kitchen table, is leverage that extends beyond local influence. The Stanfords control the County Historical Society, have influence over the bank, and clearly have the sheriff in their pocket. But there are entities they don't control. Like what? Thomas asked. The State Historical Society for one, she replied. They operate independently and take their preservation mandate seriously. Also, the University Research Department. We could apply for an emergency excavation grant that would place the discovery under academic protection. Thomas considered these options. Those might protect the discovery itself, but they don't address the foreclosure. If I lose the ranch, I lose control over what happens here, regardless of historical protection. Rebecca nodded thoughtfully. Then perhaps we need to approach this from multiple angles simultaneously. Secure historical protection while also addressing the financial situation. Their discussion was interrupted by the ringing of Thomas's phone, an unknown number. He answered cautiously. "Mr. Blackwood," a male voice greeted him. "This is Harrison Stanford, too. My son's approach lacks subtlety, but he's right that this matter has festered long enough. I'd like to meet with you privately to discuss a resolution. No lawyers, no academics, just two men whose families have been connected for generations." Thomas covered the phone and explained the call to Rebecca, who looked concerned but nodded her agreement. They needed to understand their opposition fully. "All right," Thomas said into the phone. "Where and when?" "The old covered bridge at Silver Creek, 1 hour. Come alone, as will I." The covered bridge dated back to the 1870s, one of the county's oldest structures. It spanned Silver Creek at a narrow point about 4 miles from Whispering Pines Ranch. Rarely used since the construction of the modern highway bridge downstream in the 1950s, it had become something of a historical landmark itself. "It could be a trap," Rebecca warned as Thomas prepared to leave. "Possibly," he conceded, "but the elder Stanford has always maintained a veneer of respectability. A direct attack would damage the family's carefully cultivated public image." Nevertheless, he took precautions, sending Rebecca his location details and asking her to contact the state police if he didn't check in within 2 hours. Rebecca would continue their preparation work while monitoring his location via shared GPS. The bridge came into view as Thomas rounded the final bend in the old county road, a weathered wooden structure spanning the creek. It's red-painted. Sides faded to a dull rust color, roof sagging slightly at the center. A black luxury sedan was parked at the far end, its driver standing beside it. Thomas parked his truck and approached on foot. Harrison Stanford, too, awaited him at the bridge's center, leaning on an ornate cane, his thin frame silhouetted against the afternoon light filtering through gaps in the roof planks. Despite his 82 years, the elder Stanford stood straight, his white hair neatly combed, his clothes expensive but understated. His eyes, sharp and assessing, took in Thomas's appearance with an unsettling thoroughness. "You look like him," Stanford said without preamble. "Jeremiah. There's a photograph in my father's papers. Jeremiah Blackwood facing down the sheriff at the county line. Same jaw, same eyes. You knew him?" Thomas asked, surprised. "No, but my father did. He was 10 years old during their first confrontation. In 1883, it left an impression." Stanford gestured toward the creek below. "He told me Jeremiah once physically threw a Silver Creek surveyor off this very bridge for trespassing on his water rights." Despite himself, Thomas smiled slightly. The story aligned with Jeremiah's character as revealed in his journals. "I didn't ask you here to reminisce," Stanford continued. "I asked you here to make an offer my son is too proud to extend. Double the market value of your property, plus 10% of any historical artifacts recovered and properly authenticated. You maintain naming rights to any exhibition the Blackwood discovery has a suitable ring, and receive public credit for bringing this piece of history to light." The offer was significantly more generous than anything previously proposed, acknowledging both the financial and historical value of Thomas's claim. It was, in conventional terms, a fair deal, perhaps even advantageous to Thomas personally. "Why now?" Thomas asked. "Why this sudden generosity after a century of pressure tactics?" Stanford's face remained impassive, but something flickered. In his eyes, perhaps respect for the direct question. "I'm dying, Mr. Blackwood. Cancer. 4 months, perhaps less. I've lived my entire life with my father's obsession about that land. He instilled in me an obligation to secure what he believed was rightfully ours. He tapped his cane against the wooden planks. I've accomplished everything else expected of me, expanded the family businesses, increased our political influence, secured our position. This one task remains unfulfilled. I would like to complete it before I die. The frank admission of mortality lent weight to his words. This wasn't a negotiating tactic, but a final attempt to fulfill a generational mission. And if I decline? Thomas asked. Then the conflict continues as it has for over a century, Stanford replied matter-of-factly. My son lacks my patience and historical perspective. He sees only the prize, not the process. He will pursue this with every resource at his disposal, and those resources are considerable. Thomas considered the old man standing before him. The culmination of generations of wealth, power, and entitlement, yet also simply a human being facing his mortality, seeking to fulfill what he saw as a familial obligation. Your family has tried to take this land through manipulation, legal maneuvering, and economic pressure for over 100 years, Thomas said finally. Did any of you ever consider that it might not rightfully be yours to take? Stanford's expression didn't change, but his knuckles whitened slightly on the head of his cane. Historical artifacts belong to those who can preserve and display them properly. Your great-grandfather was a stubborn obstacle to historical preservation. You're continuing that tradition, apparently. No, Thomas corrected him. I'm honoring a different tradition, standing against powerful interests who believe their wealth entitles them to whatever they want, regardless of law or ethics. He stepped closer, close enough to see the network of age lines mapping the old man's face. Jeremiah didn't just protect his land, he protected a principle. The stagecoach beneath Whispering Pines Ranch doesn't belong to the Stanfords simply because you want it or believe you deserve it. And the truth about its origins doesn't belong solely to me, despite my legal claim. What are you suggesting? Stanford asked, genuine curiosity breaking through his composed exterior. That discoveries of this magnitude should benefit the public, not just enrich a single family or corporation. I'm working with the State Historical Society to ensure proper preservation and exhibition, while retaining my family's connection to the discovery. For the first time in their conversation, Stanford appeared genuinely surprised. The State Historical Society? You'd give away millions to make a moral point? Not give away, Thomas clarified. Direct. The Historical Society will ensure I maintain operational control of the ranch itself while receiving fair compensation as the rights holder. But the discovery will serve the broader public rather than concentrating wealth that already exists in abundance within your family. Stanford studied him with newfound intensity. You truly are Jeremiah's descendant, he said finally. Equally stubborn, equally idealistic. But the world doesn't reward idealism, Mr. Blackwood. It rewards power and strategic thinking. Perhaps, Thomas acknowledged, but it also occasionally recognizes justice, especially when people stand together against exploitation. The Historical Society approach will have broad support once people understand its benefits. Fighting against it would position Silver Creek mining as an enemy of public education and cultural preservation, challenging the carefully constructed public image your family has built over generations. The strategic implications weren't lost on the elder Stanford. His family's power depended partly on the perception that their interests aligned with community welfare. Openly opposing a plan designed to direct historical discoveries to public benefit would undermine decades of carefully cultivated political goodwill. You've thought this through more thoroughly than I expected, Stanford admitted, though implementation will be more difficult than you imagine. The regulatory bodies that you control, Thomas interjected. Yes, we're aware. But regulatory obstruction becomes more difficult under public scrutiny. The historical documentation we've uncovered, combined with the community benefit approach, creates a compelling narrative that even your media connections would struggle to counter. For several moments, Stanford was silent, weighing options and implications with the calculation that had built his family's empire. When he spoke again, his tone had changed subtly. What role would you envision for Silver Creek mining in this historical society arrangement? The question revealed a strategic mind adapting to new information, seeking advantage within the changed parameters rather than simply opposing them. Thomas had anticipated this potential pivot. A partnership would be necessary, he acknowledged. The historical society needs experienced restoration and exhibition expertise, but as a partner with defined responsibilities and benefits, not as the controlling interest. Transparent operations, fair profit sharing, and academic accountability would be non-negotiable conditions. Stanford nodded slowly, his expression unreadable. An interesting proposal. Not acceptable in its current form, but perhaps negotiable. I'll need to consider the implications. He turned to leave, then paused. My son won't be as receptive to this approach. He lacks historical perspective and sees compromise as weakness. Be prepared for resistance. I am, Thomas assured him. Just as Jeremiah was. When Thomas returned to the ranch house, he found Rebecca in conversation with Sarah Donovan. The bank officer looked haggard, the strain of her compromised position evident in her hunched posture and nervous movements. Thomas paused in the doorway, surprised by the banker's presence. Sarah? Rebecca rose to greet him with evident relief. Thomas, Sarah came to warn us. She's been explaining some of the behind-the-scenes pressure from the Stanfords and how they've been manipulating the foreclosure process. Sarah nodded, her professional demeanor cracking to reveal genuine distress. They've owned me for months, she admitted. My brother Kevin got into gambling debt with some dangerous people. Stanford bought the markers from his creditors, then used them to pressure me. They threatened to have Kevin's legs broken if I didn't cooperate. Thomas took a seat across from her, processing this new information. They used you to monitor me through the bank? Sarah looked down, ashamed. My job was to accelerate the foreclosure process, deny any extension requests, and report any unusual activities. I didn't have a choice. She looked up, determination replacing the shame in her eyes. But I do now. What they're doing isn't just unethical, it's criminal. After seeing how Harrison 3 reacted today, I realize there's no line they won't cross. We don't blame you, Sarah, Thomas assured her. You were protecting your brother. But your testimony about their tactics could be invaluable in establishing a pattern of coercion and manipulation. Rebecca leaned forward. Sarah's already agreed to provide a sworn statement detailing the pressure tactics. Combined with the historical evidence and the Stagecoach discovery, we're building a compelling case that transcends local influence. That might not be necessary, Thomas said, proceeding to recount his conversation with the elder Stanford at the covered bridge. When he finished, Rebecca looked thoughtful. His willingness to discuss partnership rather than simply reject the concept outright suggests they might adapt rather than directly oppose. That could be more dangerous in some ways. They could attempt to infiltrate the historical societies, governance structure, or manipulate the terms to gradually increase their control. Which is why we need impeccable legal structuring and transparent oversight, Thomas agreed. And we need to move quickly. The foreclosure deadline is still very real. Sarah cleared her throat. About that, I might be able to help. There are procedures for reevaluation based on discovery of significant assets. It wouldn't stop the foreclosure process entirely, but it could extend the timeline substantially while the historical value is assessed. As they continued strategizing into the evening, the moral dimensions of their approach became increasingly clear to Thomas. This wasn't just about saving his ranch or defeating the Stanfords. It was about transforming a historical discovery that had been a source of conflict for generations into a resource for community benefit and education. Jeremiah had fought to protect what was rightfully his against powerful interests who believed their wealth entitled them to whatever they desired. Thomas was fighting a similar battle, but with an expanded vision, not just protecting individual rights, but advancing collective knowledge and preserving historical truth. The stagecoach beneath Whispering Pines Ranch represented both tremendous opportunity and significant responsibility. How that discovery was developed would shape not just Thomas's future, but the historical narrative of the entire region for generations to come. As darkness fell over the ranch house, Thomas stood on the porch looking out over land his family had tended for over a century. The fields were still parched, the earth cracked from drought, but beneath that temporarily barren surface lay both the history of his family's perseverance and the potential for a different kind of future than either the Blackwoods or the Stanfords had envisioned. Rebecca joined him, her presence a reminder that he wasn't facing this challenge alone. In the short time since her arrival, she had become not just an ally in the struggle against the Stanfords, but a partner in imagining a more equitable approach to historical preservation, one that balanced individual rights with public benefit, academic integrity with practical necessity. "Do you think we can actually pull this off?" he asked quietly, giving voice to the uncertainty that still lingered beneath his determination. "I think we have to try," she replied, her shoulder brushing against his as they stood side by side, looking out over the darkened fields. Some fights are worth having regardless of the odds. In that moment, Thomas felt a connection not just to Jeremiah and the generations of Blackwoods who had worked this land, but to something larger, a tradition of standing firm against exploitation, of choosing principle over expedience, of imagining how things could be rather than simply accepting how they were. The path forward remained challenging and uncertain. The Stanfords' power was real, their determination to control the stagecoach discovery undiminished, despite the elder Stanfords' willingness to consider compromise. The legal, financial, and political obstacles to establishing the historical partnership would require all their resources and ingenuity to overcome. But for the first time since the drought had begun to threaten everything he valued, Thomas felt a sense of purpose that transcended mere survival. The stagecoach discovered beneath the ancient well offered not just financial salvation, but an opportunity to honor his heritage while serving the broader community, to transform a resource that had been a source of conflict into a foundation for collective education and historical understanding. As he and Rebecca turned to re-enter the ranch house, their shadows merging in the porch light, Thomas knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, he had found both the right cause and the right ally to face them. Together, they would write a new chapter in the long story of Whispering Pines Ranch, one that might finally resolve the century-old conflict between the Blackwoods and the Stanfords, not through surrender or defeat, but through a vision of shared benefit that neither family had previously imagined. The following week unfolded with the intensity of a gathering storm. Rebecca arranged for a team from the State Historical Society to visit Whispering Pines Ranch, bringing specialized equipment for proper documentation and preservation of the stagecoach discovery. The preliminary assessment confirmed everything they had suspected. The coach was indeed the missing Northern Frontier transport vehicle that had disappeared in 1880, and its cargo of Klondike gold was largely intact. The historical significance extends far beyond the gold itself, Dr. Martin Reynolds, the Society's lead archaeologist, explained as they carefully documented each artifact. This discovery fundamentally changes our understanding of the region's development. The Stanford family's origin story, that their wealth came from shrewd mining investments, has been central to local history for generations. This evidence suggests a much darker beginning. With the Historical Society's preliminary authentication complete, Thomas and Rebecca moved to the next phase of their strategy, securing the ranch's financial future while ensuring the discovery would benefit the public. Sarah Donovan proved an unexpected ally. using her banking expertise to help draft a proposal that would satisfy both the bank's financial requirements and Thomas's vision for the property. The key is structuring it as a historical conservation easement, Sarah explained as they reviewed the documents. This legally protects both the archaeological site and the working ranch operations while providing tax benefits and opening access to preservation grants. Meanwhile, the Stanfords had not remained idle. Harrison III had filed a legal challenge to the Historical Society's jurisdiction, claiming the discovery fell under county historical ordinances his family effectively controlled. When that failed, he attempted to pressure state officials to intervene, only to discover that Rebecca had already secured support from the governor's Cultural Affairs Office. The elder Stanford had maintained public silence since their meeting at the covered bridge, though back-channel communications suggested he was considering participation in the historical partnership under specific conditions, primarily related to the Stanford family's representation in how the discovery would be interpreted and exhibited. "It's a strategic repositioning," Rebecca explained to Thomas. "If they can't prevent the truth from coming out, they'll try to control the narrative, perhaps positioning James Stanford as a hero who recovered the gold from actual thieves, or some similar revision." On the 10th day after their initial discovery, as they finalized the partnership framework with the Historical Society, the first direct counterattack came. A county cease and desist order was delivered to Whispering Pines Ranch, citing unauthorized modification of the historical water source and potential archaeological damage. The order demanded immediate halt to all activity related to the well, backed by threat of substantial daily fines. Right out of Jeremiah's journals, Thomas observed grimly, the parallels to his great-grandfather's experience, unmistakable, using regulations selectively to obstruct access to the discovery. Rebecca examined the order carefully. Signed by Commissioner Wilson, a Stanford family cousin, if I recall correctly. But the legal basis is extremely thin. We can challenge this effectively, especially with the state historical societies' involvement. Before they could file their response, a second blow landed. The state banking commissioner announced a review of Frontier Agricultural Bank's handling of foreclosure proceedings in drought-affected counties, specifically citing potentially improper extensions as an area of concern. The thinly veiled target was obvious to everyone involved. "They're attacking on multiple fronts," Sarah said, her academic detachment giving way to genuine concern. Banking regulations, historical preservation, archaeological compliance, all areas where they have planted allies over decades. Thomas might have been discouraged by this coordinated assault if not for an unexpected development the following morning. Harrison Stanford II requested another private meeting, this time at Whispering Pines Ranch itself. Against the advice of the Historical Society's legal team, Thomas agreed. The elder Stanford arrived without entourage or fanfare, his driver remaining with the car as he made his way slowly up the porch steps, cane tapping a deliberate rhythm against the weathered wood. Rebecca had reluctantly agreed to give them privacy, though she remained within earshot in case the meeting took an adversarial turn. "Your state historical society partnership has gained more traction than I anticipated," Stanford acknowledged. Without preamble, as they settled in Thomas's living room, the governor's office involvement was particularly effective, removing the possibility of regulatory obstruction at the county level. Thomas remained silent, allowing the old man to continue his assessment. "My son is pursuing a multi-pronged legal strategy to challenge your progress," Stanford continued. "It has reasonable chances of success given our established influence, though the public attention your approach has generated complicates matters significantly." He tapped his cane thoughtfully against the floor. "I've been reviewing the historical documentation your team filed with the partnership application, including materials from your great-grandfather's journals. The parallels to current tactics are instructive. Jeremiah was meticulous, Thomas replied. He documented everything: the regulatory manipulation, the selective enforcement, the attempts at financial coercion. The parallels to current tactics are remarkably consistent. Stanford nodded, neither denying nor defending the comparison. History provides perspective that quarterly profit reports cannot. I find myself considering legacy in a more expansive sense than simply fulfilling my father's directive to secure that stagecoach. He gazed around the modest ranch house, taking in the evidence of multiple generations, the height markings on the kitchen doorframe, the handcrafted furniture passed down through decades, the preserved artifacts of ranching evolution from horseback to early tractors. Your family has maintained this land through multiple crises, adapting without surrendering. Your core identity, he observed. My family has built an empire, but remains fixated on the one thing we couldn't acquire through normal means. There's a lesson in that contrast. Thomas sensed a shift in the old man's perspective, perhaps the clarity that sometimes comes with confronting mortality, or simply the wisdom of age recognizing patterns invisible to younger, more ambitious eyes. What are you proposing? He asked directly. A genuine partnership, Stanford replied. Not the operational control my son envisions, but a legitimate collaboration. Silver Creek Mining provides restoration expertise and exhibition infrastructure. The Historical Society governs academic integrity and public access, and your family maintains its historical connection while ensuring the ranch operations remain viable. He leaned forward slightly. I would require certain conditions: recognition of my family's role in regional development, balanced historical interpretation, preservation of the ranching heritage. But the core principle of public benefit and historical truth would remain intact. Thomas studied the old man carefully, looking for signs of deception or hidden agenda. What he saw instead was weariness with conflict and perhaps a desire to resolve a generational dispute before time ran out. Your son would oppose this approach, Thomas noted. Initially, yes, Stanford acknowledged. But I retain controlling interest in Silver Creek Mining until my death. I can mandate this direction despite his objections. A ghost of a smile crossed his lined face. Besides, he's politically ambitious. Once he recognizes the public relations value of the partnership approach, he'll claim credit for the idea and position himself as a champion of innovative historical preservation. The proposal was unexpected, but aligned remarkably well with Thomas's own vision, allowing for professional restoration and exhibition while ensuring public benefit and preserving the ranching heritage of Whispering Pines. It offered a path to resolution that honored Jeremiah's stand against exploitation without requiring perpetual conflict. I'd need assurances against future attempts to consolidate control, Thomas stipulated. The governance must remain independent and transparent. Reasonable, Stanford agreed. My attorneys can work with the Historical Society to structure appropriate safeguards. I imagine several independent directors with relevant expertise, but no financial ties to either the Blackwood or Stanford interests. They continued discussing framework elements for nearly 2 hours, finding surprising common ground despite their family's lengthy history of antagonism. When they eventually shook hands, it wasn't in complete agreement, but in commitment to a negotiation process that might finally resolve the century-old dispute. After Stanford departed, Rebecca and Sarah joined Thomas in the living room, eager to hear details of the unexpected proposal. It's potentially viable, Rebecca acknowledged after Thomas outlined the partnership concept. With proper structural protections and governance transparency, it could achieve our core objectives while leveraging Silver Creek's restoration expertise. The elder Stanford seems sincere, Sarah added, though his son's eventual cooperation remains questionable. Thomas nodded, still processing the implications of this potential resolution. Jeremiah fought to protect what was rightfully his. I've been fighting for something larger: historical truth, and public benefit from a discovery that technically belongs to me but should serve many. This partnership approach might achieve that better than continued conflict. Over the following weeks, the legal teams worked to develop the framework for what would be called the Silver Creek Historical Partnership, a carefully balanced collaboration between Whispering Pines Ranch, the State Historical Society, and Silver Creek Mining. The regulatory obstacles mysteriously disappeared as quickly as they had emerged, confirming the elder Stanford's continued influence despite his illness. 2 months after Thomas first discovered the Stagecoach in the ancient well community, leaders gathered at Whispering Pines Ranch for the official partnership announcement. The event was attended by regional media, state officials, and hundreds of local residents curious about an arrangement many had believed impossible given the historical power dynamics of Silver Creek County. Harrison Stanford, too, and Thomas stood together on the ranch house porch, the older man noticeably frailer but determined to personally mark this resolution to a conflict that had spanned generations. His son watched from the sidelines, expression carefully neutral, though his eyes revealed continued skepticism about the collaborative approach. This partnership represents not just responsible historical preservation, but a new model for community education and engagement, the elder Stanford told the assembled crowd. For too long, our region's history has been fragmented and incomplete. Today we commit to a different path, one that honors truth while looking forward. When Thomas's turn came to speak, he found himself thinking of Jeremiah standing on this same porch more than a century earlier, defending his right to the land against powerful interests who believed their wealth entitled them to whatever they desired. My great-grandfather dug the well that eventually led to this discovery, Thomas said, gesturing toward the stone structure now surrounded by protective scaffolding. He didn't know what lay beneath, but he knew the value of standing firm against exploitation. This partnership honors that stand, not through continued conflict, but through equitable collaboration. He looked out over the gathering, ranchers struggling with the same drought challenges he had faced, townspeople whose schools would benefit from the Historical Society's educational programs, young people who might now find reasons to remain in a county that had been steadily losing population for decades. The drought that threatened this ranch's existence led to a discovery that can benefit all of us, he continued. But the true value isn't in the gold itself, it's in what we choose to do with this unexpected opportunity. Together, we've chosen historical truth over convenient narratives, collaboration over conflict, public education over private gain. As the formal ceremonies concluded, Rebecca joined Thomas at the well where their journey had begun. The ancient stones had been carefully preserved despite the modern equipment now surrounding them, a deliberate acknowledgement of how past and present connected at this pivotal site. From desperate search for water to historical treasure partnership, she remarked, smiling at the incredible evolution of their journey. Not exactly what you expected when you started digging deeper. Nothing about the past few months has been expected, Thomas admitted, returning her smile. Especially meeting a historical archaeologist who quotes ranching journals and challenges corporate interests. Their relationship had evolved alongside the partnership concept, from professional collaboration to friendship to something deeper neither had anticipated. Rebecca had accepted a position as academic director for the new partnership, ensuring scholarly integrity in the restoration process while maintaining her university research connections. What happens next? She asked, her question encompassing both the historical project and their personal connection. Thomas looked across the fields of Whispering Pines Ranch, still recovering from drought, but showing promising signs of renewal after recent rains. The land his family had tended for generations would continue as a working ranch while the resources beneath supported broader historical education and community development. We keep building something worthwhile, he answered simply. Here and together. As evening approached, community members lingered on the ranch, exploring the property and discussing plans for the historical center's initial exhibits. Children played near the ancient well, unaware of its pivotal role in transforming their community's future. The atmosphere combined celebration of immediate victory with anticipation of long-term benefits. Thomas knew challenges remained. The younger Stanford's eventual succession would test the partnership's governance structures. Historical interpretation would require careful balancing of academic truth with family sensitivities, and maintaining a viable ranching operation, alongside a major historical attraction, would demand continuous innovation. But for the first time in generations, the path forward involved collaboration rather than conflict. The well that had run dry had led him to dig deeper, both literally and figuratively, beyond immediate crisis to historical understanding, beyond personal interest to community benefit, beyond entrenched antagonism to unexpected partnership. What had begun as a desperate attempt to save his family ranch had evolved into a model for how rural communities might preserve both historical truth and agricultural heritage. Standing beside Rebecca, as sunset painted the ranch house in warm golden light, Thomas felt a connection to both past and future, honoring Jeremiah's legacy while creating something new that would benefit generations yet to come. The dried earth had yielded not just gold, but opportunity, not just wealth, but wisdom about how prosperity might be shared rather than concentrated. The ancient well had indeed run dry, but what Thomas had discovered by digging deeper was far more valuable than water, a chance to transform not just his own circumstances, but the historical narrative of an entire community for generations to come. 3 years after the Stagecoach was first discovered at Whispering Pines Ranch, the landscape of Silver Creek County had transformed in ways both visible and intangible. What had begun as one rancher's desperate dig during drought had catalyzed changes that rippled through every aspect of community life. The most obvious physical change was the careful development of what locals now called the Blackwood Stanford Historical Center, a state-of-the-art museum and educational facility that balanced historical authenticity with visitor engagement. Unlike traditional museums with their static displays and hushed atmospheres, the center was interactive and dynamic, bringing the Klondike Gold Rush era to life through innovative exhibits and immersive experiences. Whispering Pines Ranch itself remained a working cattle operation, its fields now lush and productive, thanks to advanced irrigation systems funded through Thomas's portion of the partnership revenues. True to his commitment to ranching heritage, he had maintained and even expanded livestock operations, employing sustainable practices that would preserve the land's fertility for generations to come. Thomas stood on his porch, coffee mug in hand as he did each morning, surveying the harmonious coexistence of ranching and historical preservation that many had claimed impossible. Duke, now moving more slowly in his advanced age but still faithful, lay at his feet enjoying the early sunshine. "Admiring your handiwork?" Rebecca asked, joining him with her own mug of coffee. Their relationship had deepened alongside the community transformation, culminating in marriage the previous year, a union that symbolically bridged the academic and ranching worlds, just as their partnership had united historical preservation with local knowledge. "Just thinking about how different things looked 3 years ago," Thomas replied, slipping his free arm around her waist. "Drought-stricken fields, foreclosure notice, no future beyond the next 60 days. She leaned into him, both of them gazing at the subtle evidence of the historical center visible at the property's edge, a tastefully designed building that complemented rather than dominated the rural landscape. "From crisis to opportunity," she murmured, "though I'm not sure either of us recognized just how far-reaching the changes would be." The changes extended far beyond Whispering Pines Ranch. In town, the impact of the Silver Creek Historical Partnership was visible on nearly every street. The previously struggling local businesses had found new life catering to the steady stream of visitors drawn by the Blackwood Stanford Historical Center. The abandoned storefronts that had once symbolized the county's economic decline now housed thriving shops, restaurants, and services. The old Carnegie Library, which had been threatened with closure due to budget cuts, had been restored and expanded with an educational wing dedicated to regional history. The previously underfunded school district now boasted enrichment programs that connected students directly with their local heritage through internships at the historical center. Most significant was the shift in community trajectory. For decades, Silver Creek County had been losing population as young people left for better opportunities elsewhere. Now that trend had reversed, with families returning for the improved quality of life, stable employment, and sense of community purpose that the partnership had fostered. The quarterly report came in yesterday, Rebecca mentioned, referring to the partnership's transparent financial documentation. Visitor numbers are up 15% from last year, and the educational outreach program has expanded to 12 more schools across the state. Thomas nodded with satisfaction. The educational component had been particularly meaningful to him, a way to ensure the discovery served more than just tourism or entertainment purposes. And the Ranching Sustainability Initiative is gaining traction, Rebecca continued. 7 more ranches have joined the Water Conservation Program, and the Heritage Breed Preservation Project is attracting national attention. The Heritage Breeding Program had been Thomas's brainchild, an effort to preserve traditional cattle bloodlines that were disappearing from modern ranching, combined with sustainable grazing practices that restored native grasslands. What had begun as a side project to the historical partnership had evolved into a model program that attracted ranchers from across the region. Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of a familiar black sedan coming up the driveway. Harrison Stanford III stepped out, his appearance markedly different from their early confrontations. The aggressive corporate demeanor had softened, replaced by the more measured approach of someone who had learned valuable lessons about collaboration and community engagement. Following his father's death 2 years earlier, the younger Stanford had initially challenged aspects of the partnership agreement, as they had anticipated. But the transparent governance structure, combined with the overwhelmingly positive public response to the historical center, had gradually shifted his perspective. The political ambitions his father had mentioned had indeed materialized. Stanford was now considering a run for state office, and the successful partnership provided a compelling narrative of innovative leadership. "Thomas, Rebecca," he greeted them as he climbed the porch steps. "Sorry to drop by unannounced. I was reviewing the expansion proposals and wanted to discuss them in person before the board meeting. Coffee?" Thomas offered, their former antagonism having evolved into a working relationship based on mutual respect, if not friendship. As they settled in the ranch house dining room, still serving as an occasional meeting space, despite the partnership's modern offices in town, Stanford spread out plans showing potential expansion areas for both the historical center and the heritage ranching program. The visitor feedback surveys indicate strong interest in expanding the Gold Rush era exhibits to include more about the transportation routes and frontier life, he explained, indicating proposed additions to the main exhibition hall. And there's growing academic interest in the historical documents we've been digitizing, particularly the connection between frontier development and current land use patterns. Rebecca studied the proposal with interest. Despite the improved relationship, she maintained rigorous academic oversight of all historical interpretation, ensuring that the exhibits presented facts rather than sanitized narratives. These additions would complement the educational curriculum we've developed for middle and high school history programs, she noted, particularly if we can incorporate more of the indigenous perspective on the Gold Rush era and its impact on traditional territories. Stanford nodded, accepting her expertise without the dismissive attitude that had characterized his earlier approach to academic input. "We've initiated conversations with the Tribal Historical Preservation Office about a collaborative exhibit. Their initial response has been positive, especially regarding the land stewardship components. Their discussion continued for nearly an hour, covering both the educational aspects of the historical center and broader community impact considerations. The partnership's early success had created a framework for thoughtful expansion that balanced historical accuracy with visitor engagement and community benefit. As they concluded their meeting, Stanford paused before leaving. "There's something else I wanted to mention. The National Historical Society has expressed interest in featuring the partnership model in their annual conference as a case study in collaborative preservation. They see it as a potentially replicable approach for other communities with significant historical resources." "That would be valuable recognition," Thomas agreed, "especially the governance structures that ensure balanced representation and community benefit remains the priority. My father would have appreciated the historical validation," Stanford observed with unexpected candor. "Despite our differences, I've come to believe he genuinely wanted resolution rather than victory in his final months. This partnership accomplished that in ways neither of our families could have achieved alone." After Stanford departed, Thomas and Rebecca took a walk around the property, a daily ritual that kept them connected to both the land and their shared journey. They passed the ancient well, now preserved as a historical site with a commemorative plaque describing its role in transforming the community's future. "Sometimes I wonder what Jeremiah would think of all this," Thomas mused, touching the weathered stones his great-grandfather had so carefully placed. "Based on his journals, I think he'd approve," Rebecca replied. He wasn't fighting against historical preservation itself, but against exploitation and one-sided control. The partnership ensures balanced representation and shared benefit, precisely the principles he stood for. They continued walking toward a new addition to the Kindu Ranch, a research station where agricultural scientists studied sustainable ranching methods and heritage breed preservation. The facility, jointly funded by the partnership and the state university, represented the fusion of traditional ranching knowledge with cutting-edge science that characterized their approach to land management. The most meaningful legacy isn't just preserving what existed before, Thomas reflected, but building something better for those who come after us. That evening, the Silver Creek Community Center hosted its monthly town hall meeting, another innovation resulting from the partnership, creating regular opportunities for residents to provide input on historical programming and community initiatives. The former pattern of decisions made behind closed doors by a few powerful interests had been replaced by transparent governance and active community participation. Thomas and Rebecca sat among their neighbors rather than at the front of the room, listening as residents discussed everything from upcoming historical exhibits to scholarship programs for local students pursuing higher education. The conversation was lively but respectful, with diverse perspectives contributing to a shared vision of community development. Sarah Donovan, now serving as the partnership's financial director after rebuilding her career post-Frontier Bank, presented the quarterly investment report with characteristic thoroughness. Her brother Kevin, having overcome his gambling addiction with support from the community counseling services funded by the partnership, provided updates on the visitor outreach program he supervised at the Historical Center. The partnership model continues to attract national attention, Sarah noted toward the end of her presentation. 3 delegations from communities with significant historical resources have scheduled visits to study our governance structure and benefit allocation approach. The interest from other communities was particularly meaningful to Thomas. What had begun as a personal struggle to save his family ranch had evolved into a potential template for how rural America might address the often contentious relationship between historical preservation, economic development, and community benefit. As the meeting concluded, several teenagers presented their proposal for a student-led historical research project, focusing on the diverse cultural influences that had shaped the county's development. Their confidence and vision represented perhaps the most significant transformation A generation growing up with both expanded opportunities and a model of collaborative problem-solving rather than zero-sum competition. Walking home under a star-filled sky, Thomas and Rebecca passed the site where construction would soon begin on a community learning center, a facility that would offer educational resources for all ages, from children's programs to adult continuing education. The project exemplified their holistic approach to community development, addressing interconnected needs rather than isolated problems. From a dry well to all of this, Rebecca said, gesturing toward the thriving community around them. It still amazes me how one crisis and discovery could catalyze such comprehensive change. It wasn't just a discovery, Thomas pointed out. It was the choice about what to do with it. We could have sold to the Stanfords, or I could have fought for exclusive control and maximized personal profit. The partnership approach wasn't the easiest path, but it was the right one. Their conversation continued as they approached Whispering Pines Ranch, the renovated ranch house now illuminated by energy-efficient lighting, powered partially by the solar panels they had installed on the south-facing barn roof. The property remained the physical and symbolic heart of the partnership, the place where crisis had transformed into opportunity, where conflict had evolved into collaboration. The following morning brought news that the Historical Center's educational program had been selected for a prestigious national award, recognizing innovation and connecting students with local history. The Sustainable Ranching Initiative had approved another round of water conservation grants, helping more ranchers adapt to changing climate conditions. The community college reported record enrollment in its Heritage Trades program, teaching traditional skills that were finding new relevance in the sustainable economy. Each development represented another thread in the fabric of transformation that had been woven since that day Thomas's shovel had struck the buried stagecoach instead of water. The integrated approach to community development, addressing historical preservation, education, economic revitalization, and environmental sustainability simultaneously, had created a resilience that single-focus initiatives could never achieve. Perhaps most significant was the change in community psychology. The fatalism that had characterized Silver Creek County during its decades of decline had been replaced by pragmatic optimism, a belief that challenges could be overcome through collaborative problem-solving and equitable resource sharing. The drought that had threatened everything Thomas valued had ultimately revealed something more precious than gold, a pathway to community renewal based on shared benefit rather than concentrated wealth, on partnership rather than exploitation, on balanced development rather than single-interest control. As he watched the morning sun illuminate his fields, Thomas reflected on the journey from desperate rancher to partnership architect. The Klondike Gold beneath Whispering Pines Ranch had provided financial salvation, but the true treasure had been the opportunity to transform not just his own circumstances, but the trajectory of an entire community. The ancient well had indeed run dry, forcing him to dig deeper, both literally and metaphorically, beyond immediate crisis to historical understanding, beyond personal interest to community benefit, beyond entrenched conflict to unexpected collaboration. What he had discovered in that desperate dig was not just a valuable historical artifact, but a capacity for transformation that ran far deeper than any gold cache ever could. On a crisp autumn morning 10 years after Thomas Blackwood's desperate dig into the ancient well, the transformation of Silver Creek County had become a case study in collaborative historical preservation and sustainable rural development. Educational institutions, policy think tanks, and historical societies across the country sent representatives to study what locals now simply called the Blackwood model. Thomas stood at the edge of his eastern pasture, watching his 9-year-old daughter Emma carefully examine soil samples as part of her 4-H project. Beside her, Rebecca provided gentle guidance while their 6-year-old son Jacob attempted to mimic his sister's methodical approach with considerably less precision but equal enthusiasm. "The native grasses are coming back much faster than predicted," Emma declared with the certainty of a child raised among ranchers and academics. "That means the rotational grazing system is working." Thomas smiled at his daughter's precocious understanding of land management, a natural fusion of his practical ranching knowledge and Rebecca's scientific expertise. Emma had inherited Jeremir's meticulous nature and passion for documentation, keeping careful journals of her observations around the ranch that reminded Thomas powerfully of his great-grandfather's records. "The ecosystem restoration has exceeded our projections," Rebecca confirmed, ruffling their son's hair as he enthusiastically dug another small hole. "The 10-year data shows significant improvement in both biodiversity and soil health." Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of a small convoy of vehicles coming up the ranch's main drive. The scheduled tour of international cultural heritage experts interested in the partnership model developed at Whispering Pines Ranch. As board chairman of the Silver Creek Historical Partnership, Thomas had become an unexpected ambassador for their approach, regularly hosting delegations seeking to understand how the principles might be adapted to their own regions. "Right on time," Thomas noted, checking his watch. "Emma, would you like to show the visitors your native grassland project? They'd be particularly interested in your comparison of traditional and modern grazing impacts." Emma's face lit up at the prospect of presenting her research to important visitors, while Jacob immediately began to explain his own project investigating earthworms with more enthusiasm than scientific rigor. As they walked back toward the ranch house, Thomas reflected on how completely his life had been transformed from that moment of crisis 10 years earlier. The desperate rancher facing foreclosure had evolved into a recognized innovator in collaborative historical preservation and sustainable ranching, speaking at conferences and advising policymakers on integrated approaches that balanced cultural heritage, economic development, and community benefit. "Thomas," a familiar voice called as they approached the gathering of officials. Harrison Stanford III, now serving his second term as state senator, extended his hand in greeting. Their former antagonism had evolved into a productive professional relationship that many found surprising given their family's historical conflict. "Senator," Thomas replied with a nod and genuine smile, "I didn't realize you'd be joining the tour today. Couldn't miss the opportunity to showcase our state's most innovative public-private partnership," Stanford said, "especially with the federal Rural Revitalization Grant announcement coming next week." The transformation in Stanford had been perhaps the most unexpected development of the past decade. Following his father's death, he had initially continued challenging aspects of the partnership agreement, but as the community benefits became increasingly evident and his own political aspirations evolved, he had gradually become one of the model's most vocal advocates, incorporating its principles into state-level historical preservation policies and promoting it nationally as an alternative to traditional approaches. The visiting delegation included heritage preservation experts from 5 countries, each facing their own challenges, balancing historical conservation with community development and economic sustainability. As Thomas led them around the property, he emphasized the integrated nature of their approach. The key insight wasn't technological but philosophical, he explained as they toured the research center that had been established on the ranch's northern section. Treating historical preservation, rural livelihoods, and community development as interconnected rather than competing priorities created possibilities that weren't visible when each was considered in isolation. The research center represented that integration in physical form, combining historical documentation, sustainable ranching practices, and community education under one roof. Researchers from diverse disciplines collaborated on challenges ranging from artifact preservation to climate adaptation to intergenerational knowledge transfer. The Stagecoach discovery could have been managed conventionally, Thomas continued as they observed the original artifacts, now carefully preserved in museum-quality exhibits, that contextualize their significance within the broader regional history. Extract maximum historical value quickly, create a tourist attraction, and leave the community vulnerable when interest inevitably wanes. Instead, we chose to leverage it as catalytic capital for long-term development. One of the delegates raised a question Thomas had heard countless times over the years. But surely this required exceptional circumstances, the specific historical significance of the discovery, your family's connection to the land, the particular community dynamics. Her presentation perfectly illustrated the multi-generational thinking that had become central to the Blackwood model, honoring historical knowledge while embracing innovation, preserving ranching tradition while adapting to changing conditions. The afternoon concluded with a community dinner where visitors could interact informally with residents and hear firsthand accounts of how the partnership had affected daily life in Silver Creek County. The gathering was held in what had once been an abandoned grain warehouse but was now a thriving community marketplace where local ranchers, artisans, and small businesses showcased their products. Thomas observed the vibrant scene with quiet satisfaction. The county that had been steadily declining when he inherited Whispering Pines Ranch was now experiencing population growth, economic diversification, and cultural revitalization. Young people who would once have left for urban opportunities were finding reasons to stay or return, bringing new energy and ideas to the community. As the official delegation departed, Thomas and Rebecca walked with their children back toward the ranch, taking the longer route that passed the ancient well, now preserved as a historical monument with educational displays explaining its pivotal role in the community's transformation. "Dad, can you tell us the well story again?" Jacob asked, his fascination with the family legend undiminished despite having heard it countless times. "Well," Thomas began, lifting his son onto his shoulders. As they approached the stone structure, it started during the worst drought anyone could remember. Our ranch was dying, we had no money left, and the bank was going to take everything away. "The crisis created possibility," Rebecca replied, her academic mind always seeking patterns and principles. "By threatening everything you valued, it forced you to dig deeper, both into the earth and into yourself." Her observation captured the essence of their journey. The drought that had nearly destroyed Whispering Pines Ranch had ultimately revealed something more valuable than either water or gold: the capacity for transformation that occurs when crisis becomes opportunity, when conflict evolves into collaboration, when individual interests expand to encompass community welfare. As darkness settled over the ranch his family had tended for generations, Thomas felt profound gratitude for the apparent disaster that had forced him to dig deeper into an ancient well, a desperate act that had uncovered not just material resources but the foundation for a more equitable and sustainable future. The well had run dry, but what flowed from that seeming calamity was far more precious than water, a legacy of innovation, collaboration, and shared prosperity that would nourish the community for generations to come. This remarkable story of transformation reminds us that often our greatest challenges can lead to our most meaningful opportunities if we have the courage to dig deeper, question established patterns, and imagine possibilities beyond our immediate circumstances. If you've enjoyed this journey from crisis to community transformation, please subscribe to our channel for more extraordinary true stories that reveal the unexpected ways ordinary people create extraordinary change. And don't forget to check out our other videos showing how apparent disasters have led to remarkable innovations and opportunities. Until next time, remember that sometimes what seems like the end of one path is actually the beginning of a much greater journey, one that might impact not just your own life, but the lives of an entire community for generations to come. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.